Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new to the channel, my name is James and this is Career Insights. In this video, I'm going to cover my 3 favourite podcasts. Now, if any of you are thinking this is a bit random, what has this got to do with anything? There is a slight tie-in. One of our subscribers, not too long ago, asked me for advice that he wanted to become an engineer and what would I do in the build-up in terms of before he got a job and going into the interview process. He made suggestions to start working on CAD and practice his CAD skills, and I said, no, I would work on your soft skills and actually advise him to go and hunt out some documentaries to look at. Now, obviously not many of you would have watched all of our videos. Obviously there's so many different careers out there, but there's one thing that every single person we interview says, and that is your soft skills. Whenever we ask them about things to work on or things they recommend about the job, they always resort to the same thing, which is soft skills. So if you're not sure what soft skills are, very broadly, it covers a whole range of things, but it's things like communication, listening, empathy, things like that you need to work on. So the idea of this video is that these are 3 podcasts I've learned an awful lot from. So as you always hear me say, I think it's really important to get more than one person's perspective. And these 3 people have all been hugely successful in business and they all offer quite a lot of wisdom. So before I babble on too much, let's jump into it. The first podcast is called Startup, and this is my favourite podcast of all time. Now, the whole premise behind this is that it's about a guy called Alex who comes up with a business concept and he records the entire process. So from coming up to the idea to finding a business partner, negotiating with that business partner. And this is one of the things that I really like about the podcast is that when he meets his business partner, who they had no prior relationship before coming up with the idea and finding each other, what he does is that he records the conversation with his wife about what he thinks the percentage split should be between the 2 of them, but he also gets his potential business partner to do the same process with his wife. Now, I'm not going to ruin it, but it's obviously 2 very, very different perspectives, and it's just so great that you get all this behind the scenes access. Now, to give a bit of context, that Alex himself was actually working for a podcast company before coming up with the idea. So the idea he has is that he wants to come up with almost like a podcast network with loads of shows underneath it. So if you think about like the BBC is a good example, the BBC has tons of TV shows underneath it, and that's what he came up with in 2014, was this idea of coming up with a podcast with loads of different shows beneath it. So one of the really interesting and cool things that has come out of this podcast is that he obviously records all of the downtimes. Like, he doesn't hold back in where things are going wrong, where they're losing money, all of that type of aspect. But the really cool thing is that last year he actually sold Gimlet, which is the name of the whole sort of broadcasting company that he set up. He sold it to Spotify for over 200 million. So it's really cool to go back and listen to the first episodes in 2014 of him just coming up with this idea and kind of how rough and ready it is. And then now knowing that this year, and he records this as well, he records the sale to Spotify and the whole process when they get the phone calls and sort of chatting it over with their friends and family. But it's just so cool to know that this idea that was just an idea that he worked through eventually has this huge success story come the end of it. So I would highly recommend you go and give it a listen to. If you've ever been interested in starting your own business, what it's actually like, even just come up with names, like they go through the whole thing of how they decided on Gimlet. I just think it's super cool, and it's something that I've learned a lot about, and it was one that I tuned in to every week. They do also cover some other businesses just to give them a bit more time to record, as they're obviously be a bit boring if you're listening to it every day. So they also do cover some other businesses within that, where they follow certain people or businesses for a period of time. This is just to give their business obviously enough time to carry on and to give you more content that's actually interesting. One of the ones I remember vividly is the guy, or the ex-CEO or ex-owner of American Apparel. Hugely controversial character, but which makes for a great podcast. I recommend as well listening to that little series. I think that there's like 10 episodes of that one, which was really good. It gets a bit confrontational between him and the person that's following him and recording him, but it makes for a great dynamic and a great listen. So definitely check that one out. Number 2, Masters of Scale by Reid Hoffman. Now, I do not understand how Reid Hoffman is not more of a household name. I'm sure a lot of you haven't heard of him. So Reid Hoffman was the co-founder of PayPal and the founder of LinkedIn, which obviously sold to Microsoft for 26 billion. So this guy knows how to start a company, build a company, and ultimately sell it on. Now, one of the really cool things that I found out from listening to the podcast that I'd actually never heard of before, maybe you have, is about the PayPal Mafia that they call them. So give this a Google, give PayPal Mafia a Google, and it's absolutely fascinating how many massive companies have roots back to PayPal, which means that the staff that worked at PayPal then went on to do massive things. So to give you just the three really big companies is Google, YouTube, and obviously Tesla. So that is just three. There's so many more. Go and give it a quick Google. Now the podcast itself is obviously hosted by Reid, and obviously Reid, not only in those companies, he's now a huge investor into startup companies. So he has a background of, he was one of the first investors into Facebook. So Reid has access to the who's who of these massive companies. And as the title of the podcast suggests, Master of Scale, he's interested in the companies that have gone from relatively small companies into absolutely massive companies in a very short space of time. So two of my favorite episodes are the one on Netflix and the other one is on Dropbox. Now Netflix, just confusingly, the guy who founded Netflix is also called Reid. But the interesting thing about Reid is that how Netflix is now is how he envisaged it when he came up with the idea. So to put that into context is that Netflix actually started out trying to rival Blockbuster. So they started doing DVD deliveries, which I'm sure probably not a lot of you remember him doing. And the reason why he did that is the technology just wasn't there for how Netflix is today. Obviously like dial-up speeds, that type of stuff. It just wasn't there, it wouldn't have supported it, so it would have been an absolute flop. So he went into the DVD business purely to get customer acquisition, so to get customers to know who the Netflix name was, so that in the future, when the internet speeds were fast enough to support Netflix, he had people that he could onboard straight away, rather than it just being an idea. Now there's another really cool aspect that you should go and give a listen to, which is that him and one of his business partners go to talk to the CEO of Blockbuster to try and look to see if they want to actually acquire them. And to cut a long story short, the Blockbuster CEO basically looks at Netflix as an ant and is not interested at all. And obviously the rest is history between how the two companies worked out. Obviously Blockbuster are no longer here and Netflix are a massive giant of the world now. So the other one I found really interesting was Dropbox. So what I thought was really cool about this is that when their owner was doing the rounds of trying to get investment, so they come up with the idea and they were building it out and getting some customers, but they needed more and more investment to allow them to grow. When they were doing the rounds of investment, everybody kept telling them the same message, which was, I've heard Microsoft and Google are doing the same thing. They'll absolutely blow you out the water. And he kept saying to people, and he says this in the podcast with Reid, is that they had no chance of rivaling them. He said, you have to remember these big companies that the idea of Dropbox is probably one of 50 ideas that Google are working on at any one time. And he said, think about how those processes work in these massive companies, is that they're waiting for resource to become available. So it could be a product manager or a project manager to become available to start working on that project. They're also waiting for other staff to become available. So he said, it's not very smooth. He's like, you have to remember with Dropbox that they're focusing purely on this one task and they're driven to do it. Whereas big companies, like I just said, they've got so much resource to become available, and then they've probably got, as I've seen in big companies, it takes so long to get things signed off that they're just much slower to market. So I just thought it was this great insight that he gives, that he was completely not bothered about the big boys getting involved in his sector. I think that's a great message to tons of people thinking about starting a business, that they get completely panicked. Yeah, but the big boys do that, like we'll never be able to get a market share. But here goes to show you that just by specialising and focusing on one aspect, you'll often have a good chance against some of the big boys. So I thought that was really, really cool. The last podcast I recommend is the Tim Ferris Show. Now, if you haven't heard of Tim Ferris, he's the guy that wrote that book that everybody pretends they've read just to sound cool, which is the 4-Hour Work Week. Now, it's a very good book, but I'm not going to go into that in this. Now, this podcast is probably my least favourite out of the three, but that's not to hate on Tim. Tim's actually very knowledgeable, and so are his guests that he gets on, but this show has such a broad spectrum of guests that there's kind of no consistency between one show to the next. Probably a bit like us with Career Insights, that obviously we're talking to so many different people that you're not going to tune into every video we release. Now, when it does get good guests, like they are brilliant. So some of my favourite podcasts are when he actually, probably going back to the startup world, and he's very good friends with a guy called Chris Sacca, who's a huge and famous investor, but they're actually really good friends. So if you want to see a different side of Chris Sacca, then I definitely think like he's the guy to have a look at. And I actually came across Chris Sacca actually more from the first one, which is the Gimlet and the Startup podcast I mentioned earlier. So Chris is actually in that, I think in the first or second episode that is on that podcast. Now what happens is that Alex, who's the host, knows Chris through interviews in the past where he was a journalist. So he approaches Chris to say, look, I've got this idea, I want to talk to investors, but I just want to have a chat with you about how do I even go about investors, how do I present, that type of stuff. So it's more on a friendly basis, and Chris is unbelievably good to him, because you have to remember that getting to meet with Chris Sacca is like something that most startup companies dream of getting, and he's able to get this one-on-one conversation. They weren't like friends, they just knew each other through interviews. So Chris meets him, gives him amazing advice, but there's this brilliant bit where he sort of turns in the meeting and says, do you want me to be an investor for 5 minutes, just so I can talk to you in that vein and you can see what you're going to come up against? And it's really famous, and the Startup podcast uses this clip all the time through it, through almost every episode. And basically Chris turns into the investor, asks him question after question after question with sort of 30-second breaks between asking questions, and Alex just absolutely fumbles over his words, hasn't got a clue what to say.
If I were calling an Uber right now and it said it's going to be here in 2 minutes, and that was all the time you had, what are you doing?
So I'm making a network of digital podcasts that we will monetize. That is going to meet. Sorry.
Then Chris comes out of that mode and is really nice to him and says, look, this is what I would say if I was in your position to help you out. But he's like, go away, work on all these things that I've said, and then when you're ready, give me and my business partner a call, and then we'll make a call as to whether we want to invest, but you need to work on these things. So when I listened to that episode, I kind of became more interested in Chris Sacca and find out about him. And then I found through the Tim Ferris Show that he'd actually done a few episodes with Tim. I found it really interesting to get his insight. So he's got a really cool story in terms of he's one of those guys that has made a load of money, lost it, and then come back bigger than ever. And I think he's got a cool perspective on life and how he does things. So definitely go and check those episodes out. Now, Tim himself, he also has some really good advice. Again, I think he's a little bit Marmite, so sometimes I think he can be a bit preachy, for want of a better word, and other times he really sort of hammers home points and is very clear and concise, and that's the type of person that I kind of connect with, where it's very clear and not preachy, as I said earlier. Now, the bits I've taken from Tim are he gives this advice about going narrow. So the best way to explain this is that he talks about how he managed to get the 4-hour work week to number 1. Now, before this, Tim had absolutely no background in writing, like he wasn't a famous author, but somehow he managed to go from essentially obscurity into becoming the number 1 bestseller with that book. And what he did was, as I said earlier, he preached this go narrow, is that he focused on a few people that he wanted to get the book in front of, and he hoped that if he did get in front of those few people, that the message would kind of spread from that point on. And that's something that we've tried to take into Career Insights, is that in the beginning there's so much stuff to do to get a company off the ground that you can kind of take on too much and only get 80% done on everything, which actually means you haven't got any output whatsoever. So I think he's got very good messages along those lines, and that's kind of over time we've tried to narrow down our output and what we actually focus on, so that we can kind of build our YouTube channel first and prioritize on that, and then hopefully if we can get that to a certain level and get the website to a certain level, it will allow us to essentially go full-time on Career Insights and expand it. So I think he's got some really good educational points and some good insights and different ways of thinking. So I think I mentioned in a previous video that he has this saying about leaning into your strengths rather than focusing on your weakness. So that's another thing that I got from Tim Ferris. So he is very good when he's on point. I'm just pre-warning, sometimes it can be wishy-washy, but I guess so can we all. So hopefully you got some value from the video. These are 3 absolutely great podcasts from 3 very successful business people that have got tons of stories. I think they've all got great material that if you were to go into an interview, you've got so many stories that you could pluck from to say, oh, have you heard this, or how they started. It's just got these really intriguing and interesting points. I obviously listen to these guys all the time, and I'm forever bashing people at work with, oh, did you know this, did you know that? And it's just really fun facts. And I think what you need when you go into an interview is something to actually connect you with. And these can just be conversation starters in the hallway before you've even started the interview. Just to say off the cuff, I was just listening to this podcast, and did you know this? And it just massively eases you into conversations and interview processes, because you've not got yourself into this question backwards and forwards. You've actually now got yourself into a conversation in a much more relaxed environment. So before I babble on too much, thank you so much for watching. If you did get some value from the video, please smash the thumbs up button. It hugely helps us with the YouTube algorithm, and I'll see you in the next one.